An 87-year-old man asked for a simple sandwich at a café and was humiliated for it, but what happened next will make you cry. The café was a lively scene of murmuring conversations, laughter, and the steady hum of coffee machines. The early morning light filtered through the large glass windows, casting a warm glow on the polished tables and cozy armchairs. The familiar aromas of freshly brewed coffee and buttery pastries created a welcoming atmosphere, comforting those who stopped by for a break from their busy routines. The door swung open, and a cold draft swept through the room, momentarily interrupting the peaceful buzz. Heads turned as an elderly man shuffled in, his movements slow and careful. He looked around the room, clearly out of place amidst the polished tables and customers dressed in office attire. He was thin, his face lined with deep wrinkles, and his clothes were worn to the point of falling apart. His coat, several sizes too big and frayed at the edges, hung loosely from his shoulders, offering little protection from the biting chill outside. His shoes were old and scuffed, with visible patches where the leather had worn away. At 87, Ethan Carter was a man visibly worn by life. His eyes held a quiet resolve, but there was also a hint of desperation as he scanned the room. His hands, thin and trembling, clutched the edges of his coat as he made his way to the counter. His presence drew whispers and sidelong glances from a few patrons, some who looked away quickly, as if embarrassed to be caught staring, while others continued watching him with open curiosity or judgment. Seated by the window was Rebecca Hamilton, an elegant woman in her early 50s. She had an air of quiet confidence and sophistication, her tailored coat neatly draped over the back of her chair, and her leather handbag resting beside her. Rebecca was a successful businesswoman, known in town for her sharp instincts and poised demeanor. Her days were filled with meetings and decisions, and she rarely had time to slow down. But today, something about the elderly man's entrance caught her attention. She watched as he approached the counter, moving with a slow, almost hesitant gait. He reached the counter and looked up at the young barista, who was busy taking orders and glancing impatiently at the growing line behind him. When the barista finally noticed Ethan, she raised an eyebrow, clearly sizing him up. "Good morning," Ethan said, his voice soft but polite. "I don't have any money, but I was wondering if you might have a sandwich, something simple?" His voice trembled, but there was a quiet dignity in his manner, as if he wasn't used to asking for help but had no other choice. The barista's expression changed instantly, from polite indifference to annoyance. She looked him up and down, her mouth pulling into a tight line. "Sir, this is a business, not a charity," she said, her voice louder than necessary. A few heads turned in their direction, curious about the exchange. "If you don't have money, maybe you should try somewhere else." Ethan's cheeks flushed, and he looked down, clearly embarrassed. He managed a faint nod. "I understand," he said quietly, his voice barely audible now. "I'm sorry to have troubled you." Rebecca's heart tightened as she watched him turn to leave, his shoulders slumping slightly as he moved away from the counter. She didn't know why, but something about the scene struck her deeply. She had always prided herself on her independence, on not needing anyone's help, but seeing this man treated with such disregard felt wrong. And then, just as she was about to return her attention to her coffee, she noticed something on his wrist, a simple, worn leather watch that seemed entirely out of place on a man in his condition. The design was old-fashioned, the kind that hadn't been made in years. But what caught her attention was the unmistakable emblem engraved on the face of the watch. It was identical to a watch her father had once owned, a watch she hadn't seen in years and had long assumed lost. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat as she stared at the watch, her mind racing with questions. How could this man possibly have her father's watch? She remembered her father wearing it when she was a child, a treasured family heirloom that had been passed down through generations. The last she had seen it, it had been in her father's possession, but after his passing, it had simply vanished. Unable to resist her curiosity, she stood up and approached the man, who had found a seat near the door, his eyes downcast as if lost in thought. She cleared her throat softly, and he looked up, his expression one of mild surprise. "Excuse me," she began, her voice gentle but direct. "I couldn't help but notice your watch, it looks very familiar." Ethan looked down at his wrist, then back at her, his eyes widening slightly. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, as if unsure how to respond. "Oh, this old thing?" he said with a faint smile. "It's just a keepsake. I've had it for a long time." Rebecca hesitated, studying his face. There was something in his eyes, a glimmer of recognition, but he quickly looked away, avoiding her gaze. "You see," she continued, "my father used to have a watch just like that. It was a family heirloom, and it disappeared years ago." She paused, trying to gauge his reaction. "I was wondering, where did you get it?" Ethan's face paled slightly, and he glanced down at the watch, his hand instinctively moving to cover it. It was a gift," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "A friend gave it to me a long time ago." Rebecca felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as if she were staring into a piece of her own past. She didn't know why, but she felt compelled to know more. "Do you mind if I sit with you?" she asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. Ethan hesitated, looking around as if hoping for an escape, but then he nodded slowly. "Sure," he replied, his voice tinged with reluctance. "If you'd like." Rebecca took the seat and offered him a warm smile, hoping to put him at ease. She sensed there was more to this man than met the eye, and she wanted to understand his story. They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the cafe fading into the background as she tried to find the right words. "So tell me," she said softly, "how did you come to own that watch?" Ethan looked down, his hands trembling slightly. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice tinged with sadness. "It's a long story," he murmured. "One filled with mistakes, loss, and a lot of regrets." Rebecca listened intently, feeling a strange connection to this stranger. Little did she know, this encounter was just the beginning of a journey that would uncover secrets buried deep within her own family. Rebecca shifted in her seat, feeling a growing sense of intrigue mixed with unease as she sat across from Ethan. The way he looked down, his gaze heavy with a lifetime's worth of burdens, gave her a feeling she couldn't quite explain. She could sense that there was a story locked within him, and part of her felt driven to uncover it. After all, the watch on his wrist was no ordinary accessory. It was a direct link to her own past, and to her late father, who had meant the world to her. "Thank you for allowing me to join you," Rebecca began, her tone warm and open. "It's just that watch on your wrist, it really took me by surprise." Ethan looked down at the watch again, his fingers absently tracing the worn leather strap. He seemed almost entranced by it, as if the watch held memories he couldn't let go of. "This watch," he started, pausing as if searching for the right words, "it's all I have left of someone very important to me." Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her interest piqued. "Someone important?" she echoed, hoping he'd reveal more. Ethan nodded, though he didn't look up. "A friend from a long time ago," he said quietly. "He gave me this watch, said it was special, a family heirloom, he called it. I didn't understand at the time why he'd give me something so valuable, but he insisted." He gave a faint, sad smile. "I think he wanted me to keep it safe. Maybe he knew that things would change." Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. The story he was telling was starting to sound painfully familiar, almost as if he were speaking of her father himself. But she didn't want to press him too hard, fearing he'd close up if she pushed for too much too soon. She decided to tread carefully, hoping to draw out more details without scaring him off. "My father used to have a watch just like that," she said gently. "It was one of his most prized possessions. I remember he'd tell me stories about how his father had given it to him, and how it had been passed down through the generations." She paused, gauging Ethan's reaction. "That's why I was so surprised to see it on your wrist today. It brought back so many memories." Ethan nodded slowly, as if her words were tugging at something buried deep within him. "I didn't know much about the history behind it," he said. "My friend, he was a private man. He didn't speak much about his family. But he told me this watch meant the world to him." He looked up at Rebecca then, his eyes tired but gentle. "I suppose it's strange, isn't it? That it would end up with me, of all people." Rebecca felt a lump form in her throat. The pieces were beginning to fit together in a way she hadn't anticipated. The way Ethan spoke about the friend who had given him the watch felt personal, almost as if he were trying to protect a secret he wasn't ready to reveal. But his guarded words only fueled her curiosity. "Do you mind if I ask how you and this friend of yours met?" she ventured, hoping he wouldn't find the question too intrusive. Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair. For a moment, it seemed as though he wouldn't answer, but then he began to speak, his voice soft and filled with a distant nostalgia. "We met when we were both young men, full of ambition and dreams," he began. "We came from different worlds, but somehow, we became close friends. He had a strength about him, a confidence I admired." Ethan's eyes clouded with emotion as he spoke. "I wasn't as fortunate in life. Struggled a lot, made some mistakes along the way. But he never judged me. He always saw something in me that others didn't." Rebecca felt a pang of emotion. Her father had always been compassionate, especially toward those in need, but hearing Ethan speak of him this way added a new layer to the man she thought she knew. "We worked together for a while," Ethan continued. "We had this plan to build something. A business, something to give both of us a fresh start. But life had other plans. Things got complicated, and well, we lost touch." He looked away, his expression clouded with regret. "I hadn't seen him for years when he tracked me down to give me the watch. Told me to keep it safe, that it was the one thing he wanted me to hold on to." Rebecca's curiosity deepened. The timeline Ethan described matched with certain parts of her father's life, times he rarely spoke of. She knew her father had been involved in some risky ventures in his youth, ventures he had left behind after starting a family. But he had never shared much beyond vague references to mistakes and lessons learned. She had never imagined that someone like Ethan, now down on his luck, might have been part of that past. "Did he ever tell you why he chose you to keep it safe?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, almost as if she feared the answer. Ethan shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "No, he didn't. But I think he trusted me. He knew that no matter what happened, I wouldn't let it go. I didn't know at the time why it was so important to him, but I kept it all these years because it was all I had left of him." Rebecca swallowed, fighting back a surge of emotions. She felt an overwhelming urge to know more, not just about the watch, but about this man who had somehow remained tied to her family's legacy. Her mind raced with questions, but she forced herself to stay calm. She could sense that Ethan had barely scratched the surface of his story, and she didn't want to scare him off with too many questions. "Thank you for sharing that with me," she said softly, reaching out and placing a reassuring hand on his. "It means a lot to hear about someone who knew my father in a way that I never really did." Ethan nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He was a good man," he murmured, almost to himself. "Better than I ever deserved as a friend. I've held on to this watch, thinking that maybe one day, I'd find someone who understood why it was so precious to him. I didn't think I'd ever meet his daughter." Rebecca's heart skipped a beat at his words. She looked down at the watch, feeling a profound connection to this man she had only just met. It was as though the watch had drawn them together, bridging the gap between past and present, between two people who had loved the same man in different ways. "Maybe we were meant to meet," she said, her voice filled with a quiet conviction. "Maybe this is our chance to uncover the things he kept hidden, to finally understand the parts of him he never shared." Ethan looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Perhaps," he replied softly. "But if we go down this path, there are things you might not want to know, things that might change how you see him." Rebecca met his gaze, her mind made up. "I'm willing to take that chance. If it means understanding him better, I need to know." As they sat together in silence, the weight of their shared journey ahead settled over them. Little did they know, this meeting was only the beginning of the secrets they would uncover. Rebecca left the cafe with Ethan's story swirling in her mind, fragments of memories from her childhood surfacing as she replayed his words. The way he described her father, a man full of strength and compassion, resonated with her. But something about his story still felt incomplete. If her father had given Ethan the watch, Why hadn't he ever mentioned Ethan? Why hadn't her family acknowledged his existence? The questions nagged at her as she returned to her car, sitting in the driver's seat for a long time, lost in thought. She remembered how her father had often spoken of friends had lost touch with, people from his past he wished he could have helped more. But he had never mentioned anyone named Ethan. She wondered if her mother knew anything about him. Perhaps Ethan was part of a life her father had tried to leave behind when he married her mother. Back at home, Rebecca couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to the story than Ethan had revealed. Determined to get answers, she pulled out an old photo album, filled with pictures from her father's youth, hoping it might hold clues. Page after page, she searched for any sign of Ethan, any face that resembled the man she had met at the cafe. She found photos of her father with friends from college, gatherings with family, even snapshots of his travels abroad. But no trace of Ethan. Then she came across an envelope tucked between two pages, containing a faded letter. It was addressed to her father in an unfamiliar handwriting, with no return address. Curious, she unfolded the letter and began to read. "Dear Tom," it began. Her father's name. "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I wanted to reach out. I've thought a lot about what happened between us, and I can't shake the feeling that maybe we both made mistakes. I never meant for things to turn out this way. If you ever want to talk, you know where to find me. Yours, E." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. Ethan. The letter was dated decades ago, long before she was born, but it was proof that her father and Ethan had been in contact at one point. She read the letter again, trying to decipher the tone. There was a hint of regret, maybe even an apology. She realized now that whatever had happened between them had left a mark on both their lives. But what had they argued about? What had driven them apart? The next day, Rebecca couldn't resist returning to the cafe, hoping to find Ethan again. When she walked in, she scanned the room, but there was no sign of him. Her heart sank with disappointment. She hadn't thought to ask where he stayed, or even if he'd be coming back. But just as she was about to leave, she noticed a familiar figure sitting quietly at a table near the back. It was Ethan, his gaze distant as he stared out the window. She approached him slowly, unsure if he'd be receptive to more questions, but determined to uncover the truth. "Ethan," she said softly, drawing his attention. He looked up, surprised to see her, but he offered a faint smile. "Rebecca," he replied. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." She took a seat across from him, feeling a mix of anticipation and nerves. "I hope you don't mind. I wanted to talk some more. I found something last night that made me even more curious." Ethan raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "And what did you find?" She reached into her bag and pulled out the letter, placing it on the table. "Does this look familiar to you?" Ethan's eyes widened as he saw the letter. He reached out a shaky hand to pick it up, scanning the words quickly before looking up at her with a mixture of shock and sadness. "I didn't know he kept it," he murmured. "I thought he'd thrown it away." "What happened between you two?" Rebecca asked, her voice gentle but insistent. "Why did you lose touch?" Ethan sighed, setting the letter down and folding his hands together. He seemed to be gathering his thoughts, his face clouded with emotion. "Your father and I, we were close once. More than close. We were like brothers." He paused, his eyes distant. "But we had a disagreement. A big one. It was over a business venture we were involved in together. We both had dreams, big plans to build something meaningful. But things went wrong." Rebecca listened intently, sensing the pain in his words. "What went wrong?" Ethan looked down, his fingers tracing the edge of the letter. "We had different ideas of how to run things. He was cautious, careful. I wasn't. I made some risky decisions, choices that ended up costing us everything." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with remorse. "Your father trusted me, and I let him down. When things fell apart, he cut me out. It was the last time I saw him until he tracked me down years later, just to give me this watch." Rebecca felt a pang of empathy for him, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that he was still holding something back. "He just gave you the watch and left? No explanation?" Ethan shook his head. He didn't say much. Just told me to keep it safe, that it meant a lot to him. He looked down at the watch, his voice breaking slightly. I think he knew that things were beyond repair. It was his way of saying goodbye. Rebecca's mind raced as she processed his story. It sounded plausible, but something still didn't add up. Why would her father make such a meaningful gesture if he truly wanted to leave Ethan behind? And why had he never mentioned Ethan, or the failed business venture, to her or anyone else? Ethan, she said cautiously, there has to be more to this. My father wasn't the type to hold grudges. If he gave you the watch, he must have cared about you, even after everything that happened. Are you sure there's nothing else? Ethan hesitated, looking away. His silence spoke volumes, and Rebecca's suspicion grew. She was certain now that he was keeping something from her, something that went beyond a simple business deal gone wrong. I don't know what else to tell you, he finally said, his voice barely audible. Sometimes, people change. They go their separate ways. Rebecca didn't believe him, but she decided not to press further. She could see the tension in his face, the way his hands shook as he held the letter. Whatever had happened between him and her father, it was clear he wasn't ready to talk about it. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Ethan, she said softly, I know this must be difficult, but I'm here to listen whenever you're ready. Ethan nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude and a hint of sadness. Thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate that. As she left the cafe, Rebecca knew their conversation was far from over. There were too many unanswered questions, too many secrets lurking beneath the surface. And she was determined to uncover them, no matter what it took. Over the next few days, Rebecca found herself constantly thinking about her conversations with Ethan. The mystery surrounding her father's watch gnawed at her, refusing to let go. She had spent her life believing her father to be a man of integrity and compassion, and she wanted to believe that Ethan's story would ultimately affirm that image. But the unanswered questions about their relationship and the watch left her restless. One evening, while organizing some of her father's old things, Rebecca came across a box she hadn't noticed before, tucked away in the back of a drawer in his study. It was small and nondescript, almost hidden, as if her father hadn't wanted it to be found easily. She pulled it out, her heart racing with anticipation, hoping it might contain more clues about his past with Ethan. Inside, she found a series of faded photographs, a few personal documents, and a small leather-bound journal. The photos were old, showing a young, vibrant version of her father and another man, a man who looked strikingly like Ethan in his youth. They were pictured together in various locations working on what looked like a construction site, posing in front of a small office, laughing together over drinks. The camaraderie and friendship between them were unmistakable. Rebecca's heart ached as she looked at the photographs, feeling as if she were peeking into a part of her father's life that had been completely hidden from her. Why had he never told her about this chapter of his life? She wondered what could have happened to turn such close friends into strangers. Setting the photos aside, she turned her attention to the journal. It was filled with notes in her father's handwriting, chronicling his dreams, his struggles, and most surprisingly, his friendship with Ethan. The entries painted a picture of a young man full of hope, eager to make a difference in the world and excited to build something meaningful with his friend. As she read, she felt closer to her father than she had in years, his youthful energy leaping off the pages. But as she continued reading, the tone of the entries began to change. She could sense her father's disappointment, his frustration, and his growing distrust toward Ethan. One entry stood out to her. March 10th, Ethan's taking too many risks. I don't know how to tell him that his choices are putting everything we've built at stake. I tried talking to him, but he brushes it off, says I'm worrying too much. But I can't shake this feeling. If we keep going down this path, there won't be anything left. Rebecca closed the journal, her mind reeling. This was the first time she had seen her father express doubt about someone so openly. She realized that his relationship with Ethan had been more complicated than she had imagined. It wasn't just a simple case of two friends drifting apart, it was a friendship that had been tested by differing values and choices, and ultimately by betrayal. But the journal only gave her part of the story. There was still the mystery of the watch itself, the final link her father had left behind. She resolved to confront Ethan again, to press him for answers she knew he had been avoiding. The next morning, Rebecca returned to the cafe, hoping to find him in his usual spot. To her relief, he was there, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee, looking out at the street with a distant expression. She approached him, her heart pounding, determined to finally get to the bottom of things. "Ethan," she said, her tone firmer than before. He looked up, surprised to see her, but he nodded and gestured for her to sit down. "Rebecca," he greeted her, offering a faint smile. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." "I have more questions," she said directly, pulling out the journal and setting it on the table between them. "I found this. It's my father's journal, and it talks about you, about the business you two tried to start, and the risks you were taking." She paused, watching his reaction. "Why didn't you tell me everything?" Ethan's expression hardened as he looked down at the journal. He reached out and gently touched it, his fingers trembling slightly. "I didn't think it was necessary," he said slowly. "I didn't want you to see me as the reason things fell apart." "But you were," Rebecca replied, her voice barely a whisper. "You were the reason, weren't you?" Ethan nodded, his face etched with regret. "Yes. Your father was a good man. Too good, maybe, for someone like me. I made choices that hurt him. And he couldn't forgive me for it. That's why we parted ways." Rebecca took a deep breath, trying to keep her emotions in check. "Then why did he give you the watch?" she demanded. "Why would he entrust something so important to you after everything that happened?" Ethan hesitated, looking down at the watch on his wrist. "I think he wanted me to remember the man I had once promised to be. To remember that I had let him down." Rebecca's heart twisted as she watched him, his face filled with a sadness she couldn't fully comprehend. She could see now that he carried the weight of his mistakes with him, that the watch was not just a memento but a reminder of his own failings. But then Ethan's expression changed, a flicker of something darker crossing his face. "There's something else you should know," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't just your father's friend, I was in love with someone close to him. Someone he loved deeply." Rebecca's eyes widened as she processed his words. "Who?" Ethan looked away, his face clouded with pain. "Your mother." The revelation hit Rebecca like a punch to the gut. Her mother? The woman who had been her father's lifelong partner, who had always spoken so highly of him and had cherished his memory even after his passing? The idea that she could have been involved with Ethan was almost unthinkable. "My mother never mentioned you," she said, her voice shaking. How could you be in love with her?" Ethan sighed, his shoulders slumping. "We met before she knew your father. We were young, and I thought we had a future together. But then your father came into her life, and she fell in love with him. She chose him, and I accepted it. But there was always a part of me that couldn't let go. When I came back into your father's life, it was like reopening old wounds for both of us." Rebecca felt a mix of anger, confusion, and pity as she looked at him. "So my father knew?" Ethan nodded, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Yes. He knew, and he forgave me for it. But I think it was always there, in the back of his mind, that I had once loved the woman he cherished. I think that's why he gave me the watch. He wanted me to carry the weight of my mistakes with me." Rebecca sat back, her mind spinning. The watch was more than just a family heirloom, it was a symbol of forgiveness, of love lost and found, and of a friendship that had been tested in ways she could barely comprehend. She looked at Ethan, seeing him not as a stranger but as a man deeply intertwined with her family's past, a man who had both loved and hurt the people she cared about most. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly, her voice choked with emotion. "I think I needed to hear this." Ethan nodded, his expression softening. "Sometimes, the past doesn't stay where we leave it," he murmured. "But maybe now we can both find some peace." Rebecca left the cafe feeling a whirlwind of emotions. The revelations Ethan had shared lingered in her mind, filling her with a mix of anger, confusion, and sadness. The idea that her father and Ethan's friendship had been fractured by secrets and unresolved feelings struck her deeply. Her mother's silent role in all of this felt equally haunting. How had she never mentioned Ethan, a man who had clearly been part of their lives in such a profound way? The next morning, Rebecca decided to pay a visit to her mother, who lived in a quiet neighborhood just outside of town. She knew her mother had kept mementos and keepsakes from her father's life, and Rebecca hoped that talking to her might shed more light on the past Ethan had hinted at. When Rebecca arrived, her mother greeted her warmly, though she sensed that her mother's intuition picked up on her tense demeanor. "Rebecca, honey, it's so good to see you," her mother, Margaret, said with a smile, ushering her inside. The warmth of her mother's home, with its familiar scent of lavender and fresh linen, was a welcome comfort. Rebecca had always felt safe here, but today her heart was heavy with questions. "Mom," Rebecca began after they had settled in the living room, "I wanted to ask you something about Dad." Margaret's expression softened as she nodded. "Of course, dear. What do you want to know?" Rebecca hesitated, unsure of how to bring up Ethan's name without causing alarm. "Do you remember a man named Ethan Carter?" Margaret's face shifted, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She pursed her lips, glancing down at her hands as she smoothed a wrinkle in her skirt. "Yes, I remember Ethan," she said slowly, her voice tinged with an old sadness. "He and your father were close, once. But things happened, and they lost touch. I didn't know you knew about him." Rebecca took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the secrets between them. "I met him recently," she admitted. "We ran into each other at a café. He told me a little about the past, about the business he tried to start with Dad, and how they eventually drifted apart." Margaret looked away, her expression troubled. "There was more to it than that," she said softly. "Your father loved Ethan like a brother, but their friendship was tested in ways that were hard to overcome. There were things they never fully reconciled." Rebecca sensed that her mother was holding back. "Mom, he told me something else. He said he loved you. That you were together before you met Dad. Is that true?" Margaret's face went pale, her eyes widening in shock. For a moment, she seemed too stunned to speak. She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Yes," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "It's true. Ethan and I were young, and we thought we were in love. But when I met your father, everything changed. I realized that Tom was the one I wanted to spend my life with." Rebecca felt her chest tighten. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Why didn't Dad tell me?" Margaret sighed, reaching out to hold Rebecca's hand. "We didn't think it was necessary. By the time you were born, Ethan was out of our lives. Your father forgave him, but he wanted to leave the past in the past. We never spoke of it again. But Ethan still cared about you," Rebecca pressed. "He never really let go." Margaret looked away, sadness etched into her features. "I know. I could see it in his eyes whenever he looked at me. But I chose your father, Rebecca. I chose our family. I knew Ethan couldn't give me the life I wanted, and I think deep down, he knew it too." Rebecca felt a surge of empathy for her mother, but also a deep sense of sorrow for Ethan. He had loved Margaret, only to lose her to his closest friend. It was a tragedy that had haunted him, and she wondered if he had ever truly moved on. "Do you think that's why Dad gave him the watch?" Rebecca asked. "To let him carry that part of the past with him?" Margaret nodded slowly. "I believe so. Your father was a forgiving man, but he was also human. I think giving Ethan the watch was his way of closing that chapter, while reminding Ethan of the importance of loyalty and trust." Rebecca sat back, absorbing her mother's words. She understood now why her father had chosen to keep Ethan at a distance, even as he offered him a parting gesture of forgiveness. It was a complex, bittersweet relationship, one forged by friendship, love, and ultimately, betrayal. As Rebecca prepared to leave, she felt a sense of clarity. She needed to return to Ethan and give him the closure he deserved. She couldn't change the past, but she could offer him peace, knowing that her family had moved on and forgiven him. That afternoon, Rebecca returned to the café, half expecting Ethan not to be there. But as she entered, she spotted him at his usual table, gazing out the window with a look of quiet melancholy. She approached him, her heart heavy but her resolve firm. "Ethan," she said softly as she sat down across from him. He looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and relief. "Rebecca," he murmured. "I didn't expect you'd want to see me again." She took a deep breath, meeting his gaze. "I spoke with my mother," she began. "She told me everything. About your past with her, and about what happened between you and my father." Ethan's face tightened, as if he had been bracing for this moment. He nodded, looking down at his hands. "I never wanted to hurt your family," he whispered. "I loved your mother, yes. But she made her choice, and I respected that. I wanted to make amends with your father, but I think it was too late by then." Rebecca reached out, placing her hand over his. "I think in his own way, my father did forgive you. He wanted you to carry the watch, not as a punishment, but as a reminder of the friendship you once shared." Ethan's eyes glistened with tears, his voice choked with emotion. "Your father, he was a good man. I didn't deserve his kindness after everything that happened. I carried this watch all these years, not just as a reminder, but as a burden. I couldn't let go of the past, and maybe that's why I ended up like this, lost and alone." Rebecca's heart ached for him. She realized that Ethan had been trapped in a cycle of guilt and regret for decades, unable to forgive himself even as her father had extended his forgiveness. She felt a surge of compassion and a desire to help him move forward. "Ethan," she said gently, "you don't have to carry that burden anymore. My family has forgiven you. Maybe it's time you forgave yourself." Ethan looked at her, his expression softening as her words sank in. For the first time, she saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes, as if a weight he had carried for far too long was finally lifting. "Thank you, Rebecca," he whispered. "I didn't know how much I needed to hear that." They sat together in silence, the years of pain and regret melting away as they shared a moment of quiet understanding. For both of them, this was a step toward healing, a chance to let go of the past and embrace the peace that had eluded them for so long. As the days passed, Rebecca found herself reflecting more on Ethan's story and the revelations it had brought to light. Her father, whom she had always seen as a pillar of loyalty and integrity, had navigated a life far more complex and painful than she had ever realized. The hidden relationship between her father, mother, and Ethan weighed heavily on her, and while she felt that she had begun to uncover the truth, there was a nagging feeling that the story wasn't over yet. One evening, Rebecca received a call from her brother, James, who lived in another state. They spoke occasionally, mostly about family updates or holiday plans, but they rarely discussed their parents in depth. She decided to share some of what she had discovered, wondering if he might remember anything that could shed more light on the mystery. "James," she began, after they exchanged pleasantries, "have you ever heard of a man named Ethan Carter?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, James replied, his voice cautious. "Why are you asking about him?" Rebecca felt her heart skip a beat. "You know him?" James hesitated, and she could almost hear him weighing his words. "I remember hearing the name when we were kids," he admitted. "I never met him, but I knew he was someone Dad didn't want us to know about. Whenever I asked Mom, she would get this look almost like she was sad. She told me he was an old friend of Dad's who made some mistakes." Rebecca's pulse quickened. "Did Dad ever tell you what happened between them?" "No," James replied, a hint of frustration in his voice. "And I never pressed him for answers. You know how private he was. I figured it was one of those things from his past that he didn't want to talk about." Rebecca took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I met him, James. He's still around. I found out that he and Dad had a falling out years ago. But it was more than just a business dispute. He and Mom, they were involved before she married Dad." James was silent, the weight of the revelation settling between them. That's a lot to process," he finally said. "I always thought Dad's past was just a series of stories he didn't want to tell, but this, I never thought it ran this deep." Rebecca nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I know. I feel like I'm just scratching the surface of something much bigger." They talked a while longer, sharing memories of their father, trying to piece together the fragments of his life they'd been unaware of. When they hung up, Rebecca was left with an even stronger desire to understand the full story. She couldn't shake the feeling that her father's past held more secrets, ones that might explain why Ethan had drifted into obscurity after all these years. The following morning, Rebecca decided to visit a local archive where she knew some old city records were kept. If her father and Ethan had once been business partners, there might be documentation of their venture, records that could reveal more about what had transpired between them. After a bit of searching, she found herself staring at a stack of papers related to a small business venture registered by her father and Ethan over 40 years ago. The business was called Carver Carter Solutions. She combed through the files, finding ledgers, letters, and notes between her father and Ethan. In the beginning, the records were filled with optimism, detailed plans for a small contracting business, notes about potential projects, and even letters from prospective clients. But as she continued reading, the tone of the documents began to shift. Expenses had started to pile up, and there were entries in the ledgers indicating that money had been misallocated or spent on unapproved projects. Then, she came across a document marked confidential. It was a letter from her father to a legal advisor, detailing his concerns about Ethan's management of the business. In the letter, her father expressed a growing unease with Ethan's risky investments and a suspicion that he was using company funds for personal ventures. Rebecca's stomach twisted as she read. The letter painted a picture of a man trying to save a crumbling business, his frustration and fear evident in every word. It was clear that her father had cared deeply about the venture and had tried to protect it, even as his trust in Ethan began to erode. Toward the end of the file, she found another document, this one from Ethan to her father. It was a desperate apology, filled with promises to make things right. He admitted to mishandling funds, attributing it to poor judgment, and an attempt to give us both a better life. The letter was heartfelt, almost pleading, as Ethan asked for a chance to prove himself and restore their friendship. Rebecca realized that Ethan's mistakes had cost them both dearly, not only in terms of finances but in the irrevocable damage to their friendship. Her father had tried to keep the business afloat, but Ethan's choices had ultimately driven them apart. She understood now why her father had been so hurt, why he had felt forced to cut Ethan out of his life. But she also saw the remnants of love and forgiveness in the final gesture of giving Ethan the watch. Her father had held on to his loyalty, even if he couldn't fully trust Ethan again. Rebecca returned to the café that afternoon, feeling a sense of resolve. When she entered, she saw Ethan in his usual seat, his hands clasped together as he stared into the distance. She took a seat across from him, her expression serious. "Ethan," she began, "I found the records from your business with my father. I saw everything, the letters, the financial documents. I know what happened." Ethan looked down, his face etched with shame. "I knew it would come out eventually," he said softly. "I was young, reckless. I thought I could turn things around, that if I made one big move, I could make us both rich. But I was wrong. I lost everything. And worse, I lost the one friend who believed in me." Rebecca nodded, her voice gentle but firm. "You didn't just lose a friend, Ethan. You lost a family. My father tried to help you, and when things went wrong, he still forgave you. But it hurt him deeply. You were like a brother to him." Ethan's shoulders slumped as he absorbed her words. "I've spent the last few decades regretting what I did," he murmured. "I wish I could go back and change it, make it right. But I know that's impossible." Rebecca reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You may not be able to change the past, but maybe you can find peace. My father gave you the watch as a reminder of the good you shared. He didn't want you to live in guilt forever. He wanted you to remember the friendship, not the mistakes." Ethan looked up at her, his eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve that forgiveness," he whispered. "But am grateful he offered it. I carried this watch with me as a reminder of everything I lost, but maybe it's time I look at it as a reminder of everything I gained, too." Rebecca squeezed his arm, a smile breaking through her serious expression. You don't have to carry the burden alone, Ethan. My family has forgiven you. And maybe it's time you forgive yourself. For the first time, she saw a glimmer of hope in his face. He nodded, his eyes misting over with relief and gratitude. Thank you, Rebecca. I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything, she replied softly. Just let go of the past, and maybe start thinking about what the future could hold. Together, they sat in silence, the weight of years of regret and unspoken forgiveness finally lifting as they shared a moment of peace and understanding. In the days following her conversation with Ethan, Rebecca found herself feeling lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from her own shoulders. Learning the full story of her father's friendship with Ethan had brought her a deeper understanding of her father's character, his compassion, his forgiveness, and his willingness to see the best in others, even when they had let him down. Yet, a new question began to creep into Rebecca's mind. What was she meant to do with this knowledge? Ethan had shared his regrets, and he had accepted the forgiveness that her family had extended, but Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that something more was required. Ethan had spent years struggling, living on the fringes of society, without a home, and without the stability that her father had once tried to help him build. Now that she knew his story, Rebecca felt a growing sense of responsibility toward him. As she pondered this, memories of her father surfaced. He had always been generous, not only with his family but also with those in need. It was a value he had instilled in her, urging her to help where she could and never to turn her back on someone in need. But even as she considered offering more help to Ethan, a part of her resisted, wondering if she was about to cross a line her father had chosen not to. One evening, she confided her dilemma to her brother, James, during a phone call. "James, I feel like I should do something for Ethan," she said, her voice laced with uncertainty. "He's lived so many years on his own, struggling. Now that we know the full story, I can't just leave him like this." James sighed, pausing before he responded. "I get it, Rebecca. I understand why you feel that way. But are you sure this is something Dad would want? He forgave Ethan, yes, but he also chose not to bring him back into our lives. Maybe that was his way of setting a boundary, of moving on." Rebecca considered his words, her heart torn. She knew her father's choice to forgive Ethan didn't necessarily mean he would have wanted to re-establish a relationship with him. Forgiveness and reconciliation were two different things. But something about this felt different, like her father would want her to take the extra step, to extend kindness beyond mere forgiveness. "I know, James," she replied, feeling the weight of her decision. "But I think maybe it's my turn to make that choice. Maybe it's time to try something different, to offer Ethan a chance at a fresh start." James was silent for a moment, and then he said, "If that's what you feel in your heart, then I'll support you. Just be careful. Don't take on more than you can handle. You have a life too, Rebecca." After the call, Rebecca sat in quiet reflection. Her brother's advice was sensible, but her conviction remained. She knew that offering Ethan a hand up wasn't about righting the wrongs of the past, it was about helping him find a way forward. She could almost hear her father's voice encouraging her to be compassionate, to extend grace where it was needed most. The following day, Rebecca arranged to meet Ethan in the cafe once again. She arrived early, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and apprehension as she thought through the offer she was about to make. When Ethan arrived, he looked surprised to see her, a faint smile softening his features as he sat down across from her. "Rebecca," he greeted her, his voice warm. "It's good to see you." "It's good to see you too, Ethan," she replied, trying to keep her nerves in check. She took a deep breath before continuing. "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about, and about the friendship you shared with my father. I know you've been through a lot, and I don't want you to go through the rest of your life alone." Ethan looked at her, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Rebecca, I appreciate the thought, but I've managed on my own for years now. I don't want to be a burden to anyone." "You're not a burden, Ethan," she insisted. "In fact, I'd like to offer you a place to stay, at least temporarily. I know it might feel strange, but I don't want you to be without a home, especially not after everything you've been through. You deserve a fresh start, and I'd like to help you find it." Ethan's expression softened, and for a moment, he looked as though he might cry. He glanced down at his hands, his voice choked with emotion. Rebecca, I don't know what to say. I never thought anyone would offer me something like this. Rebecca reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on his. You don't have to say anything, Ethan. Just think about it. It's a temporary arrangement, and it's up to you. But I want you to know that you don't have to face this alone anymore. Ethan took a deep, shaky breath, nodding slowly. Thank you, Rebecca. This is more than I deserve, but I'll consider it. I don't know what the future holds, but maybe it's time I stopped trying to carry everything by myself. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them processing the significance of what had just been offered. For Ethan, it was a chance to reclaim a part of himself that he had long thought lost, to build a new life free from the weight of past mistakes. For Rebecca, it was an opportunity to honor her father's legacy, to extend the compassion he had shown to so many others. The days that followed were filled with preparations as Rebecca helped Ethan transition into a modest apartment not far from her own. She furnished it with a basic bed, a table, a few chairs, and kitchen supplies. Though it was simple, it was a space he could call his own, a place where he could begin anew. She watched as he settled in, noting the cautious optimism that seemed to brighten his spirit with each passing day. One afternoon, as they unpacked a box of books she had picked up for him, Ethan turned to her, his eyes shining with gratitude. Rebecca, I don't know how to thank you. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life forgotten, but you've given me hope. Rebecca smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest. You don't have to thank me, Ethan. This is a new beginning, a chance to move forward. Let's leave the past where it belongs and focus on building something better. Ethan nodded, his face lighting up with a smile that transformed him, erasing the years of hardship from his expression. For the first time in decades, he felt a sense of belonging, a chance to reconnect with the world he had withdrawn from. It was a feeling he hadn't known since he and Rebecca's father had parted ways all those years ago. In the weeks that followed, Ethan began to rebuild his life, finding small ways to give back to the community that had once ignored him. He volunteered at a nearby shelter, offering his time and kindness to those in need. With Rebecca's support, he began to see himself not as a man defined by his mistakes, but as someone capable of redemption. Watching Ethan thrive, Rebecca felt an overwhelming sense of pride and fulfillment. She had given him the help he needed, and in doing so, she had honored the legacy of her father's compassion. Ethan had found his place in the world once more, and Rebecca knew that her decision to help him had been the right one. As the months passed, Ethan began to settle into his new life, a life that he had never dared to dream of after years of solitude and struggle. Rebecca continued to check in on him regularly, and each visit deepened their bond. She found herself looking forward to their conversations, savoring the stories he shared about her father, and even small details about her mother from a time she could scarcely remember. In an unexpected way, Ethan had become like a familiar connection to her past and a constant presence in her present. One evening, as they sat together in Ethan's modest apartment, Rebecca looked around, pleased to see how much he had made the place his own. Small to chase a cozy throw blanket, a stack of books, a framed photograph of her father, and him that she'd found among her father's belongings had transformed the apartment into a warm, lived-in space. Do you remember the first time you and my father met? She asked, leaning forward with a smile. Ethan chuckled, his eyes crinkling with the memory. Oh, I remember it well. He was fresh out of college, all suit and tie, while I was, well, a bit rough around the edges, let's say. He smiled fondly, shaking his head. He had this way of looking at the world, like he could see something good in everyone he met. It's what made him special. He never gave up on people, even when he probably should have. Rebecca felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with pride. Her father had indeed been a remarkable man, and hearing Ethan's stories helped bring him to life in a way she hadn't experienced before. The stories filled in the gaps of her father's life, showing her not just the successful businessman, but the compassionate friend and dreamer he had been in his youth. But as the evening wore on, Rebecca noticed a certain sadness in Ethan's expression. He had shared so many fond memories, yet there was a sense of regret in his eyes, a lingering shadow of the life he had lost. Rebecca realized that while he had made incredible strides, there was still a part of him that struggled to accept the kindness and forgiveness he had been shown. "Ethan," she said softly, "you've come a long way. I see how much you've grown since we first met. But I also see that you're still holding on to something, some guilt, maybe?" Ethan sighed, his shoulders slumping as he looked away. "It's hard, Rebecca. Even after all this time, it's hard to forgive myself for the way things ended with your father. I still wonder what might have been if I hadn't made those mistakes. I spent so many years in his shadow, feeling like I had failed him and myself." Rebecca reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You didn't fail him, Ethan. My father knew the risks, and he chose to forgive you. I believe he saw you as family, just as much as he saw us. You're here now, rebuilding, and that's what matters." Ethan nodded slowly, squeezing her hand. "I suppose I just never imagined I'd get a second chance. I thought I'd be carrying my regrets to the grave. But you have that chance now," Rebecca replied, her voice full of encouragement. "And I think my father would be proud of you. He'd be glad to see you finding peace." As they continued talking, Rebecca realized that Ethan's story, his friendship with her father, and their own bond had given her something she hadn't expected. In him, she had found not only a friend but a father figure, someone who could carry on the stories and wisdom that her father had left behind. And for Ethan, Rebecca had become a surrogate daughter of sorts, a connection he hadn't known he needed, but one that had filled a void in his heart. One afternoon, Rebecca decided to bring her brother, James, to meet Ethan. She felt it was important for him to know the man who had shared so much of their father's life, to see for himself the bond they had formed. James had been initially hesitant when she told him about her decision to help Ethan, but she hoped this meeting would show him that it had been the right choice. When they arrived at Ethan's apartment, Rebecca noticed the nervous look in her brother's eyes. She gave him a reassuring smile as they knocked on the door. Ethan greeted them warmly, though he looked surprised to see James. "Ethan, this is my brother, James," Rebecca said, introducing them. "I wanted him to meet you, to hear some of the stories you've shared about Dad." Ethan extended his hand, a slight tremor in his voice. "James, it's a pleasure to meet you. Your father, he was a great man. I'm honored to know his family." James nodded, shaking Ethan's hand firmly. He looked around the apartment, taking in the small details that revealed how much effort Ethan had put into creating a home. As they settled in, Ethan began sharing memories of their father, telling stories that James and Rebecca had never heard before. They laughed together at the antics of their father's youth, the challenges he and Ethan had faced, and the way he had never lost his optimism, even in difficult times. As the afternoon passed, James' initial hesitance seemed to melt away, replaced by a warmth and gratitude for the chance to hear about his father from someone who had known him so intimately. He looked at Ethan with a new sense of respect, realizing the sacrifices and hardships that had shaped the man before him. "Thank you, Ethan," James said finally, his voice filled with sincerity. "I didn't know what to expect when Rebecca told me about you, but I see now why she felt it was important to help you. My father, he must have meant a lot to you." Ethan nodded, his eyes misting over. "He meant everything to me. He was my friend, my brother, and well, he was a better man than I ever deserved as a friend. But knowing you and Rebecca, it's like he's still here, like a piece of him lives on." Rebecca felt a sense of pride and fulfillment as she watched the two men connect. She had done what her father might have done, extending compassion and grace to someone who had been left behind. And in doing so, she had not only honored her father's memory but had also created a new family dynamic, one that embraced Ethan as part of their own. In the weeks that followed, James became more involved, occasionally joining Rebecca to visit Ethan. The three of them grew close, forming a bond that felt like a natural extension of the family ties they had once taken for granted. They shared dinners, celebrated holidays, and began to build memories that honored the legacy of their father. For Ethan, these gatherings were a chance to experience the family he had always dreamed of but never believed he could have. With each visit, he felt his heart heal a little more, his guilt and regrets dissolving as he embraced the love and support that Rebecca and James had given him. One evening, as they sat around the table sharing stories and laughter, Ethan looked around, his heart full. He realized that, in a way, he had found a family again. The wounds of his past had begun to fade, replaced by a sense of peace and belonging he hadn't felt in years. Rebecca glanced at him, her own heart filled with gratitude. She had taken a chance, extended a hand to a man in need, and in return, she had gained something she hadn't expected: a family reimagined, bound by love, forgiveness, and a shared history that honored her father's memory in the most beautiful way. As the relationship between Rebecca, James, and Ethan deepened, the three of them settled into a comfortable rhythm. Rebecca found joy in introducing Ethan into family gatherings, and James began to see the wisdom in her decision to bring him into their lives. It was almost as if Ethan had filled a void left by their father, a bridge to their family's past that had been missing. One autumn afternoon, Rebecca received a call from James. His tone was serious, and she sensed something unusual in his voice. "Rebecca, there's something you should know," he began, his words slow and deliberate. "I did some digging into Dad's past after meeting Ethan. I wanted to make sure we had the whole picture." Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. "What did you find?" James sighed. "It turns out Dad kept one last secret about Ethan, something that changes everything." Rebecca listened intently as James continued. "Do you remember Dad's will? How he left most of his estate to us but mentioned a separate trust he created years ago? Well, that trust was actually in Ethan's name. Dad set it up to be given to him when and if he ever decided to come forward and reclaim his life. I don't think Dad ever gave up on him, Rebecca. Even after all those years." Rebecca's mind spun with this revelation. Their father had created a safety net for Ethan, a chance for him to rebuild his life if he ever needed it. She couldn't believe that her father, even after their painful parting, had planned so carefully for Ethan's future. The knowledge filled her with a deep sense of pride and gratitude for the father she had known, but it also raised more questions. Why wouldn't Ethan have known about it? She asked, bewildered. Did Dad not tell him? James paused, considering her question. Maybe he left it as an open invitation, a way for Ethan to reach out if he ever needed help. Perhaps Dad knew Ethan would struggle with pride or guilt. But whatever the reason, it was there, waiting. Rebecca's heart ached at the thought of Ethan struggling on his own for so many years, unaware of the trust that could have lifted him out of hardship. She knew she had to tell him, but she wasn't sure how he would react to such a revelation. Would he feel betrayed by the fact that her father had kept it hidden? Or would he feel grateful for the opportunity it now presented? Determined to share the news with Ethan, Rebecca invited him over to her home the following evening. As he arrived, she noticed the comfortable ease in his demeanor, a stark contrast to the nervous, withdrawn man she had first met months ago. He had come to trust her, to see her as family, and Rebecca knew that what she was about to tell him would shake him deeply. They sat in the living room, and after a few moments of catching up, Rebecca took a deep breath, deciding it was time. "Ethan, there's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice soft but steady. "It's about my father. There's a part of his legacy he left for you, something he never told you about." Ethan looked at her, his expression a mixture of curiosity and caution. "What do you mean?" Rebecca clasped her hands together, choosing her words carefully. "After you and my father parted ways, he set up a trust in your name. It was his way of ensuring that, no matter what happened, you would have a safety net if you ever needed it. He didn't tell you because I think he wanted you to find your way back on your own terms." Ethan's face went pale, and he leaned back, his eyes filled with disbelief. "A trust? For me?" he whispered. "But why would he do that? After everything I did?" "Because he never stopped caring about you, Ethan," Rebecca replied, her voice thick with emotion. "He may have distanced himself, but he still saw you as family. He wanted you to be safe, to have a chance at a new beginning if you ever wanted it. Ethan's hands trembled, and he looked away, struggling to process the weight of her words. All these years I thought I was alone. I thought I had no one. And yet he was still there, watching over me in his own way. Rebecca reached out, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. My father believed in redemption, Ethan. He wanted you to know that you weren't defined by your mistakes. He gave you this gift as a way to show that he forgave you. Ethan closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling as he took deep breaths. Tears slipped down his cheeks, his voice choked with emotion. I don't know what to say, Rebecca. I spent so long hating myself, thinking I had ruined everything. I never thought I'd still care. Rebecca's heart swelled with compassion as she listened to him. Maybe it's time for you to let go of that guilt, Ethan. My father wanted you to move forward. He wanted you to have a second chance. Ethan opened his eyes, meeting her gaze with a look of raw gratitude and vulnerability. I can't thank you enough, Rebecca. For everything. For giving me a chance, for telling me this, and for bringing me back into your family. Overwhelmed by emotion, he leaned forward and embraced her, his shoulders shaking as he wept. Rebecca held him, her own eyes filling with tears as she felt the magnitude of his journey, the years of isolation, the bitterness he had carried, and now, the profound relief of forgiveness and belonging. After a long moment, they pulled back, and Ethan wiped his eyes, a soft smile breaking through his sadness. What happens now? He asked, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Rebecca smiled, her heart lightened by his question. Now we move forward. Together. You're part of this family, Ethan. You always have been, and you always will be. In the days that followed, Rebecca helped Ethan access the trust her father had left for him. The funds allowed him to pay off debts, secure his modest apartment, and even support the shelter where he had been volunteering. He used the money thoughtfully, investing in small ways that reflected his new purpose and desire to give back to others. As Ethan embraced this new chapter, he became a mentor at the shelter, sharing his story of hardship and redemption with others who were struggling. He found fulfillment in helping those who reminded him of his past self, and through his work, he finally felt he was living up to the values Rebecca's father had believed he could embody. Rebecca watched with pride as Ethan continued to rebuild his life, no longer burdened by the shame and regret that had once held him back. Her father's legacy lived on through Ethan, not just in the financial support, but in the compassion and grace he extended to others. On a chilly winter evening, as Rebecca and James joined Ethan for dinner, she realized that their family had grown in ways she had never imagined. They had formed a bond that transcended bloodlines, one rooted in shared stories, forgiveness, and the kindness her father had instilled in them all. For Ethan, it was the family he had never expected but always longed for. And for Rebecca, it was a reminder that love, in all its forms, had the power to heal even the deepest wounds. With each passing month, Ethan's life transformed in ways he had once thought impossible. The small, secure apartment he called home was not only a haven from the hardships of his past but a place where he could truly rebuild himself. As he grew closer to Rebecca and James, the sense of family they had given him filled his heart with gratitude and a purpose he hadn't felt in years. One winter afternoon, Rebecca and James invited Ethan to join them for a family gathering. It was a simple dinner with close friends, but it marked a special milestone, the first time Ethan was introduced not as a distant friend of the family but as part of it. Rebecca's mother, Margaret, had agreed to join them, and Rebecca was curious to see how the evening would unfold. Margaret had been supportive of Rebecca's decision to help Ethan, but there was a distance in her approval, a reluctance that hinted at unresolved feelings from the past. Ethan arrived at Rebecca's home with a bouquet of flowers, looking around nervously as he stepped into the warmth of the living room. The scent of baked bread and roasted vegetables filled the air, and the laughter of friends echoed softly from the dining room. When Margaret saw him, she paused, her eyes widening with recognition and surprise. For a moment, it was as though the years melted away, and she was face to face with the young man she had once known. "Margaret," Ethan greeted her softly, his voice filled with emotion. It's been a long time. Margaret gave him a faint, wistful smile, nodding as she took in the familiar lines of his face. Yes, it has, Ethan. Her tone was gentle but guarded, and Rebecca sensed a quiet tension between them, as if words unspoken hung heavy in the air. Rebecca moved closer, gently placing a hand on her mother's shoulder. I thought it was time we all came together, as a family, she said, her voice filled with warmth and encouragement. She guided them both to the dining table, where they joined the rest of the guests. As they sat down, Ethan and Margaret exchanged a few polite words, their eyes occasionally meeting in fleeting glances. Rebecca watched as a fragile truce seemed to form between them, the past settling like a soft mist rather than a weight. Dinner was filled with laughter and stories, the warmth of friendship enveloping them all. As dessert was served, Rebecca raised a glass to make a toast, her voice full of pride and affection. To family, she began, looking around the table. To forgiveness and new beginnings. And to my father's memory, which has brought us all here together in ways I could never have imagined. Everyone raised their glasses, and Ethan's eyes shimmered with gratitude as he looked at Rebecca. He knew that her father's spirit was present in this moment, that the kindness and compassion Rebecca had shown him were reflections of the man he had once called his closest friend. After dinner, Margaret approached Ethan, her face softened with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. She invited him to join her in the quiet of the living room, away from the bustle of the others. They sat together, the silence between them filled with unspoken memories and the ghosts of years long past. I wanted to say thank you, Ethan, Margaret began, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for coming here, for finding a way back to us. I know it wasn't easy. Ethan looked down, gathering his thoughts before he spoke. Margaret, I owe you more thanks than I can ever express. I spent so many years regretting the choices I made, the things I lost. But being here, with you and the family, has given me a peace I never thought I'd find. Margaret nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. Tom would have wanted this, you know. He never stopped caring about you. You meant the world to him, even after everything. Ethan's gaze softened, and he reached out, gently placing a hand on hers. I know. I think I've come to understand that, thanks to Rebecca and James. Your husband, he was the best man I ever knew. And I've spent years trying to live up to the kindness he showed me, even when I didn't deserve it. They sat together in silence, the weight of forgiveness settling between them like a balm, easing the pain of old wounds. In that quiet moment, both of them felt the final threads of the past loosen, replaced by a sense of closure and understanding. They had come full circle, and the shared grief they had once carried had transformed into a quiet gratitude for the people they had loved and lost. As the evening drew to a close, Rebecca and James walked Ethan to his car, the cold night air crisp against their cheeks. Ethan turned to them, his eyes bright with emotion as he searched for the right words. I don't know how to thank you both, he began, his voice trembling. You've given me a family, a home, and a chance to heal. It's more than I ever hoped for. Rebecca smiled, reaching up to embrace him. You've given us just as much, Ethan. You've helped us reconnect with our father's memory in a way we never thought possible. And you've become part of our family. That's all the thanks we need. James nodded, his own voice thick with emotion. Dad would be proud, Ethan. Proud of you, and proud of all of us for finding a way to be here together. Ethan's eyes misted over, and he took a deep breath, feeling a peace settle over him that he hadn't known in decades. Thank you, he whispered, pulling both of them into a tight embrace. Thank you for everything. As he drove home that night, Ethan felt the weight of the past finally lift, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging that filled his heart. For so long, he had thought he would be haunted by his mistakes, defined by the shadows of regret. But now, he understood that he had been given a second chance, a chance to live not as a man burdened by guilt, but as someone who had been redeemed by love and forgiveness. In the weeks that followed, Ethan continued to build his life around the people he had come to cherish. He deepened his involvement at the shelter, helping others find hope and direction, just as Rebecca and her family had helped him. Through his work, He found new meaning, a purpose that extended beyond his past and into a future that held promise and peace. Rebecca, James, and Margaret embraced Ethan as a permanent member of their family, a living testament to the power of forgiveness and the resilience of the human spirit. They celebrated birthdays, holidays, and quiet family dinners, creating new memories that honored the man they had all loved so deeply. And as the years passed, they found that the bonds they had formed grew stronger, filling their lives with joy and connection. Ethan had found his place, not just as a friend but as a beloved member of their familiar role he had never expected but had come to treasure. In the end, the cafe where they had first met became a distant memory, a beginning to a story that had transformed all of their lives. Ethan had found redemption, Rebecca had honored her father's legacy, and together, they had built a family reimagined, bound by love, forgiveness, and a shared belief in the power of second chances. The past had finally come to rest, and the future was filled with light. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will move you too. Have a good session.